The sense of suffering. Introduction. A painful and difficult experience, suffering is an unavoidable aspect of being human and frequently acts as a catalyst for significant spiritual development. This audiobook examines the ways in which adversity and struggle can help one gain a better understanding of their spiritual journey. Challenges have the power to shatter the ego and cultivate humility, resilience, and compassion by making people face their limitations, consider their purpose in life, and look for meaning in suffering. From Buddhism to Christianity, religious and philosophical traditions highlight the transforming potential of suffering, imparting the knowledge that it can result in self-realization and a stronger bond with the divine. Through suffering, individuals are often pushed to reflect on their lives, confront their attachments, and embrace vulnerability. This process not only deepens self-awareness, but also strengthens one's capacity for empathy and service to others. Practices such as meditation, prayer, and acts of service provide spiritual tools to navigate suffering and turn it into a path for personal and spiritual growth. Ultimately, this article highlights that while suffering is painful, it can serve as a powerful force for transformation, offering valuable lessons and a deeper connection to one's spiritual journey. Chapter 1. The Role of Suffering in Spiritual Growth. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Viktor Frankl. The notion of suffering is something most people recoil from, and understandably so. It brings pain, uncertainty, and a sense of powerlessness. Yet suffering has a curious ability to transform, shape, and even elevate the human spirit in ways that comfort and ease cannot. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, psychiatrist, and author of Man's Search for Meaning, understood this truth deeply. Imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps, Frankl experienced suffering at its most extreme. Stripped of everything, including his freedom, his family, and his very identity, he turned inward and found that within suffering lay an unyielding power, the power of choice, the ability to find meaning in suffering and grow spiritually from it. Frankl's story is not an isolated one. Across history, some of the most profound spiritual growth in individuals has arisen not from times of peace, but from moments of intense struggle and pain. Suffering, paradoxically, often acts as a profound gateway to spiritual awakening. It shakes us out of complacency, breaks down the illusions of control, and forces us to confront the deeper questions of life. Why are we here? What truly matters? And how can we find peace amidst the storm? In this audiobook, we will explore how suffering, though deeply challenging, is not merely an affliction but a powerful catalyst for spiritual growth. Suffering, when approached with the right mindset, fosters resilience, compassion, and a deeper understanding of oneself and the greater spiritual truths of the universe. It tears down the barriers of ego and attachment, allowing us to connect more intimately with our spiritual path. By the end of this exploration, you may come to see suffering not as a curse to be avoided, but as a teacher that, however painful, offers invaluable lessons for the soul. Throughout human history, suffering has been an inescapable part of existence. But what makes suffering particularly intriguing is the way different religious and philosophical traditions have approached it. In Christianity, suffering is often seen as redemptive. Jesus' crucifixion is the ultimate example of divine suffering that brings salvation to the world. "Take up your cross," Jesus said, signaling that suffering, when embraced, could bring one closer to God. In Buddhism, suffering is central to understanding the nature of existence itself. The first noble truth declares that life is suffering, dukkha, but the Buddha also offered a way out of this suffering through spiritual practices and enlightenment. Hinduism too acknowledges suffering as part of the karmic cycle, where pain and adversity are essential for spiritual purification and evolution of the soul. The topic of why suffering exists has long been a source of debate among philosophers. The Stoics, especially Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, accepted that pain is an unavoidable aspect of life, but they also held that a person's character is defined by how they handle hardship. Epictetus, who was disabled at a young age and was born a slave, is credited with saying that what matters is how one responds to life's circumstances, not what happens to them. The Stoic perspective on suffering emphasizes acceptance and inner fortitude, with the idea that a person's virtues can be enhanced and their comprehension of the meaning of life can be furthered via suffering. But even beyond these customs, we are profoundly affected personally by suffering. It is universal. No one is immune to it, whether as a result of disease, a loved one passing away, grief, loss, or personal failure. Suffering is difficult for everyone, but if we let it be, it can also be transforming for everyone. Many who suffer greatly say that their darkest hours gave them the most insight into who they were and what they wanted to do with their lives. Take Nelson Mandela, for instance. He was imprisoned for 27 years in South Africa under the harsh apartheid regime. In his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, Mandela reflects on how suffering in prison taught him patience, compassion, and a deeper understanding of human dignity. His suffering didn't break him, it refined him. Rather than emerging bitter and vengeful, Mandela emerged as a global symbol of reconciliation and forgiveness. His suffering shaped his spiritual and moral outlook, deepening his resolve to fight not just for justice, but for peace and unity. What is it about suffering that leads to such transformation? At its core, suffering strips away the superficial layers of life. In times of comfort, it's easy to be distracted by material pursuits, status, and fleeting pleasures. But suffering forces us to confront what lies beneath these distractions. It reveals our vulnerabilities, our fears, and our deepest desires. It is in these moments of vulnerability that the ego, our sense of self that craves control and certainty, begins to crumble. With the collapse of the ego, we are more open to new perspectives and to the realization that life is much bigger than our individual struggles. Suffering often leads to surrender, not in the sense of giving up, but in the spiritual sense of letting go. We stop resisting what we cannot change and instead open ourselves up to deeper truths about life, love, and the divine. Suffering also cultivates compassion. When we endure pain, we become more empathetic to the suffering of others. Compassion is one of the highest spiritual virtues, and suffering often provides the fertile ground for it to grow. When we recognize that everyone around us is fighting their own battles, we begin to approach the world with more kindness and understanding. In this way, suffering doesn't just transform us inwardly, it transforms how we interact with the world. Moreover, suffering builds resilience. When we survive hardship, we come to realize our own strength. The human spirit is incredibly resilient, and suffering has a way of showing us just how strong we are. Spiritual growth often comes not from avoiding suffering, but from facing it head-on and coming through it with a deeper sense of purpose and connection to the divine. Each time we endure suffering, we learn more about ourselves and our capacity to grow. Suffering is not something anyone actively seeks out, but when it arrives, it offers profound opportunities for spiritual growth. It pushes us to reflect, to surrender, to develop compassion, and to build resilience. It challenges us to let go of our ego-driven desires and open ourselves to deeper spiritual truths. Whether through the teachings of religion, philosophy, or personal experience, suffering reveals itself as one of the most potent forces for spiritual transformation. Through it, we find meaning, we find strength, and ultimately we find our way closer to the divine. Chapter 2. The Nature of Suffering. A universal human experience. Suffering is a kind of greatness. John Keats. Few truths are as inevitable and universal as suffering. No matter who you are or where you come from, at some point in life you will face pain, loss, and hardship. From the moment we are born, we encounter struggle, the laborious process of birth itself, the challenges of childhood, and eventually the heartbreaks, illnesses, and deaths that punctuate human life. Suffering touches us all indiscriminately, whether through the ache of grief, the sting of failure, or the confusion of existential uncertainty. It is the great equalizer, uniting every human being in a shared vulnerability. But suffering is not merely an affliction to be endured. It is a profound opportunity for transformation, an essential part of the spiritual journey. To live is to suffer. It is an inescapable aspect of the human condition. Consider the range of experiences that connect every person to this reality: the physical pain of illness, the emotional devastation of losing a loved one, the mental anguish of grappling with failure, and the ultimate reality of death. Each of these experiences, though unique in their expression, share a common thread. They shape us, leaving behind scars but also wisdom. From the very beginning of life, we are met with suffering. Birth itself is a painful and traumatic process, both for the mother and the child. It is the first lesson that life is not easy, and that hardship is woven into the fabric of existence. As we grow, we encounter various forms of suffering: falling ill, experiencing heartbreak, dealing with rejection, and eventually confronting the loss of loved ones. And though we often strive to avoid or minimize suffering, it is undeniable that life's challenges are unavoidable. In his famous work, The Road Less Traveled, psychologist M. Scott Peck opens with the simple but profound statement, "Life is difficult." This acknowledgement is not meant to bring despair, but to remind us that suffering is natural. It is not a personal failure or a punishment, it is the nature of life itself. And because it is inevitable, the real question becomes not how to avoid suffering, but how to respond to it. Throughout history, a major subject in both religious teachings and philosophical thought has been the universal experience of suffering. Every tradition provides a different perspective on pain, yet they all come to the same conclusion. Suffering has a purpose, it has a function, frequently acting as a route towards development, change, and a better comprehension of things. Christians frequently see suffering from the perspective of redemption. Christ on the crucifixion is a powerful illustration of how suffering can result in redemption when it is accepted with charity. According to Christian doctrine, going through hardships is both a necessary component of being human and a way to become more spiritually pure. It is believed that Jesus' crucifixion represented the height of selflessness and love, and that his willingness to go through unspeakable agony was the key to granting humanity eternal life. According to this idea of redemptive suffering, adversity may serve a greater good by bringing people closer to God and developing empathy and compassion. Buddhism takes a different yet equally transformative approach to suffering. At the heart of Buddhist teachings is the first noble truth: dukkha, or suffering, is inherent in life. According to Buddhism, all life is marked by suffering, whether through physical pain, emotional distress, or the unsatisfactory nature of impermanence. However, rather than viewing suffering as something to be feared or avoided, Buddhism teaches that suffering can be transcended through understanding its causes. The path to enlightenment, or nirvana, involves confronting suffering directly, recognizing its roots in attachment and desire, and cultivating mindfulness to break free from its hold. In this sense, suffering becomes not an obstacle to spiritual growth, but the very starting point of the journey toward spiritual liberation. Stoicism, the ancient Greek philosophy, also addresses the inevitability of suffering, yet offers a practical approach to enduring hardship with grace. Stoic thinkers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius recognized that suffering is a part of life, but emphasized that what truly matters is how we respond to it. According to Stoicism, we cannot control external events, whether illness, loss, or death, but we can control our internal response. The Stoics believed that by cultivating inner resilience and practicing virtues like courage, patience, and wisdom, one can endure suffering without being consumed by it. Suffering, in their view, is not to be avoided, but to be endured as an opportunity for strengthening the soul. It is through hardship that one's true character is revealed and refined. These traditions, Christianity, Buddhism, and Stoicism, each offer different perspectives on suffering, but they all converge on a powerful truth. Suffering is a necessary part of spiritual growth. Whether it leads to redemption, enlightenment, or inner fortitude, suffering holds within it the seeds of transformation. If suffering is inevitable, then the question becomes, how can we use suffering as a catalyst for spiritual growth? The answer lies in how we choose to respond to it. Hardship, while painful, can act as a doorway to deeper self-awareness and spiritual insight. It strips away the illusions of control and permanence that often dominate our lives, forcing us to confront the fragility and uncertainty of existence. For many, suffering marks the beginning of a profound spiritual journey. When life's comforts are taken away, when we lose a loved one, face a debilitating illness, or endure a personal failure, we are often pushed to question the deeper meaning of life. Why do we suffer? What is the purpose of this pain? And how can we find peace amidst it? These questions are the starting points of spiritual awakening. In times of suffering, we are forced to let go of superficial concerns and focus on what truly matters. We begin to seek answers not in material success or external validation, but in the inner depths of our being. This is the moment where suffering transitions from being a source of despair to a source of enlightenment. Hardship often serves as a mirror, reflecting our vulnerabilities, our attachments, and our fears. It shows us the limits of our control and the transient nature of life. But within this mirror, we also see the possibility of growth. By facing suffering head-on, we learn to cultivate inner resilience, to develop compassion for ourselves and others, and to seek meaning in life's challenges. Suffering forces us to confront our deepest selves, and in doing so, it offers the opportunity for profound transformation. In this way, suffering is not the end of the spiritual journey, but the beginning. It is through hardship that we are given the chance to transcend the ego, to grow in wisdom and empathy, and to deepen our connection with the divine. And while suffering is painful, it is also the crucible in which the soul is refined, leading us closer to the ultimate truths of existence. Through suffering, we learn not just to survive, but to thrive spiritually. It is the fire that tempers the spirit, shaping it into something stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. It is, in the end, one of the greatest teachers on the path to spiritual growth. Chapter 3. How Suffering Leads to Spiritual Growth. In the depth of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer. Albert Camus. Suffering is an inevitable part of life, and while it can be overwhelming and painful, it also serves as a gateway to spiritual growth. For many, moments of deep suffering are the very moments when the most profound spiritual transformations occur. When hardship breaks the comforts and certainties that shield us from life's deeper realities, it also breaks open the soul, allowing for a new level of awareness, compassion, and resilience to emerge. Suffering has a way of breaking down the barriers we construct to protect ourselves, most notably the ego, and humbling us in ways that can lead to profound self-discovery. Through suffering, we are not only forced to reflect on the deeper questions of life, but also given an opportunity to cultivate inner strength and empathy for others. Suffering is, at its core, a humbling experience. When we encounter pain, loss, or failure, it becomes painfully clear how little control we have over life's circumstances. The ego, which thrives on the illusion of control, power, and security, is shattered in the face of suffering. Suddenly, the things we thought defined us, our status, achievements, possessions, and even relationships, are stripped away, leaving us vulnerable and exposed. This process, though deeply uncomfortable, is one of the key ways that suffering fosters spiritual growth. The ego is the part of us that craves validation, recognition, and attachment to external outcomes. It is the source of many of our desires, fears, and insecurities, constantly seeking to protect its own image and maintain a sense of superiority. However, suffering forces us to confront the limitations of the ego. When faced with hardship, we are reminded that no amount of success or external validation can shield us from life's inevitable difficulties. In this way, suffering humbles us, making it possible for us to let go of the ego-driven desires that once held us captive. Spiritual teachings from a wide range of faiths place a strong emphasis on accepting and surrendering to pain. Mindfulness techniques in Buddhism help people to separate from the aversions and appetites that cause suffering. We can feel a greater sense of inner peace, even in the face of hardship, if we can let go of our connection to worldly possessions and recognize the fleeting nature of everything. In a similar vein, submission to God's will throughout difficult circumstances is viewed in Christian doctrine as a means of achieving spiritual development. To transcend the ego and have a more profound and meaningful relationship with the divine, we must relinquish our need for control and place our faith in a higher force or a bigger cause. So suffering becomes a gateway to emancipation. We are no longer motivated by the need to establish our own credibility or amass material possessions as the ego is destroyed. Rather, we learn to be more in the moment, more aware of life's basic realities, and more receptive to accepting life as it is, without resistance. Although ego disintegration is a difficult process, it is one of the most important steps on the path to spiritual enlightenment. The wound is the place where the light enters you, as Rumi once said. We are frequently able to glimpse the light of spiritual knowledge via the fissures in our ego and the scars of sorrow. Suffering as a catalyst for self-reflection. Beyond breaking down the ego, suffering also serves as a powerful catalyst for self-reflection. When we are comfortable, it is easy to coast through life without questioning our deeper purpose or values. We become consumed by the day-to-day concerns of work, relationships, and societal expectations, rarely stopping to ask ourselves what truly matters. Suffering disrupts this complacency, forcing us to confront the existential questions that we often avoid. In times of hardship, we are compelled to look inward. The things we once relied on for stability, whether it be a job, a relationship, or a sense of physical security, may no longer be available to us. This creates a space for introspection, where we must confront the meaning of our lives, our choices, and our beliefs. Suffering pushes us to examine the very foundations of our existence. Why are we here? What is the purpose of this pain? What values guide our actions? These questions, though difficult, are essential to the process of spiritual growth. Personal crises often serve as turning points for people on their path to spiritual awakening and increased self-awareness. A loss can rock us to our core and force us to reassess our priorities and realign our lives with what really matters, whether it be the loss of a loved one, our work, or our sense of self. Suffering acts as a spiritual alarm clock in this way, luring us out of the dream of trivial worries and directing our focus toward the more profound realities of life. We get to know ourselves better and establish a stronger sense of purpose through this introspective approach. Many people who pursue spirituality claim that their most formative experiences occurred during times of extreme hardship. These painful experiences, whether they involve a loved one's passing, a health issue, or a severe setback, often result in deep spiritual revelations. Suffering exposes the deeper levels of our soul that yearn for connection, purpose, and development by removing the barriers that prevent us from realizing the truth of our being. Suffering not only leads to greater self-awareness, but also cultivates two of the most important virtues on the spiritual path: compassion and resilience. When we endure hardship, we gain a deeper understanding of the struggles faced by others. Our own pain allows us to empathize more fully with the suffering of those around us, breaking down the barriers of separation and fostering a sense of shared humanity. Compassion, one of the highest spiritual virtues, is often born from the ashes of our own suffering. Through suffering, we learn to soften our hearts and approach others with kindness, patience, and understanding. It becomes clear that everyone is fighting their own battles, often unseen, and that we are all in need of grace. This realization deepens our capacity for love and service as we seek to alleviate the suffering of others, just as we have sought to heal our own wounds. In this way, suffering becomes a bridge that connects us to others and strengthens our sense of community and shared purpose. At the same time, suffering builds resilience, the inner strength to endure adversity and continue moving forward with grace and courage. Each time we face a challenge and survive, we learn more about our own capacity to overcome difficulty. This resilience, born from hardship, becomes an invaluable tool on the spiritual path, allowing us to navigate future obstacles with greater ease and confidence. Suffering is ultimately not something to be avoided or feared. It serves as a teacher, giving us the opportunity to develop in ways we never would have thought possible. Suffering helps us develop compassion and resilience, dismantle our egos, and consider the greater purpose of life. These are the same attributes that promote spiritual development and bring us nearer to the divine and our actual selves. In the words of Khalil Gibran, out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls. The most massive characters are seared with scars. Suffering, while painful, holds within it the seeds of transformation, leading us toward a deeper, more authentic understanding of our spiritual path. Chapter 4. Spiritual Teachings on the Transformative Power of Suffering. Suffering is not a punishment. It is a wake-up call to deeper truths. Eckhart Tolle. The greatest spiritual teachers, sages, and writings in human history have acknowledged that pain is a process that can result in profound learning and enlightenment, rather than merely an unfortunate circumstance that must be borne. Suffering is frequently portrayed in religious and spiritual traditions not as a simple endurance test, but as a sacred journey that leads to a better understanding of oneself, spiritual awakening, and a close relationship with the divine. The lesson is evident in both the old Christian story of Job and the Buddhist journey of Siddhartha. Pain has the capacity to effect spiritual transformation. It reveals the underlying truths that are at the center of our existence by penetrating life's outer layers. The transformative power of suffering is deeply embedded in religious narratives, where figures often emerge stronger, wiser, and closer to the divine after enduring great trials. One of the most powerful examples of this can be found in the Bible's story of Job, a tale that has inspired countless individuals to reflect on the nature of suffering and its role in spiritual growth. Job, a righteous and prosperous man, is subjected to unimaginable suffering when he loses his wealth, family, and health in a series of catastrophic events. His friends and even his wife urge him to curse God and abandon his faith, but Job remains steadfast, though he questions and laments the pain he endures. He demands answers from God, seeking to understand why the righteous must suffer. What makes the story of Job so powerful is not just the endurance of suffering, but the spiritual transformation that comes from it. In the end, when God finally speaks to Job, the message is not one of justification or simple explanations. Instead, Job is shown the vastness of creation and the limitations of human understanding. Through his suffering, Job comes to recognize the profound mystery of life and the divine. His faith is deepened, not because he receives what he lost, but because he emerges from his suffering with a more expansive understanding of the universe and his place within it. Job's journey is emblematic of how suffering can break down the barriers of ego and self-righteousness, leading to a deeper spiritual wisdom. In Buddhism, suffering plays an equally crucial role, not as a punishment or test, but as the very foundation for spiritual awakening. The story of Siddhartha Gautama, who later became the Buddha, is perhaps one of the most profound examples of how suffering can lead to enlightenment. Born into wealth and luxury, Siddhartha was shielded from the realities of human suffering until one day he encountered old age, sickness, and death. These experiences shook him to his core, and he realized that no amount of pleasure or wealth could shield him from the suffering inherent in life. Resolved to comprehend the essence of suffering, Siddhartha gave up his life as a prince and set out on a spiritual quest. The Four Noble Truths, that suffering is a part of life, that attachment and desire are the source of suffering, that suffering can be transcended, and that practicing mindfulness and compassion is the way to do so, were revealed to him when, after years of penance and meditation, he reached enlightenment beneath the Bodhi tree. Thus, suffering is both inevitable and essential for spiritual development, as revealed by the Buddha's teachings. People search for freedom and a closer connection to the fundamental realities of life because they are aware of suffering. These stories, along with countless others from religious and spiritual texts, demonstrate that suffering is a sacred teacher, one that leads individuals away from superficial pursuits and toward the inner depths of spiritual wisdom. Whether through the trials of Job or the enlightenment of the Buddha, the message is clear. Suffering, though painful, can be the very thing that awakens the soul to its true purpose. Along with lessons about resiliency and perseverance, suffering frequently results in deep mystical experiences. Many people find that times of intense pain can act as doorway to a deeper sense of oneness with the universe or the divine. These experiences, also referred to as dark nights of the soul, can heighten one's spiritual consciousness and give rise to a sense of having caught a glimpse of a reality that is deeper and more profound than what is normally understood. The Spanish poet and mystic Saint John of the Cross is credited with describing the dark night of the soul as a time of profound spiritual desolation during which a person feels comfortless and abandoned by God. This is one of the most well-known stories of mystical insight gained through suffering. But St. John also believed that this gloomy night was an essential component of the spiritual path, a cleansing fire that burns away ego and false attachments, so the soul might become more fully one with the divine. Not only does suffering cease for those who persevere through the dark night, but they also gain a closer, more profound relationship with God. The black night guides the soul toward a deeper unity with the eternal. It is a gift, not a punishment. Similar to this, suffering is viewed as a gateway to transcendence in many mystical traditions. The Sufi mystic Rumi frequently discussed the ability of suffering to transform people, characterizing it as a way of being broken open to absorb divine love. As Rumi puts it in one of his best-known poems, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Those who have had mystical experiences during periods of extreme agony may find enormous resonance in the thought that suffering is what makes us open to the divine. Suffering makes people vulnerable by tearing down their ego and self-reliance walls and opening them up to a greater sense of oneness with the cosmos and the divine. Religious leaders are not the only ones to have these spiritual encounters. Many report feeling a shift in consciousness following moments of extreme pain brought on by disease, bereavement, or personal crises. They speak of an inner calm that surpasses their prior perceptions of reality, as well as a sense of clarity and unity with the universe. These revelations frequently occur in the depths of a person's suffering, when their mind and heart are most receptive to learning new things, rather than during times of comfort. The connection between suffering and mystical insight is one that has been recognized throughout history. From the saints and mystics of the Christian tradition to the Sufi poets of Islam and the enlightened masters of Buddhism, suffering is often seen as a necessary initiation into the deeper mysteries of existence. It is through the crucible of pain that individuals are able to transcend their ordinary consciousness and glimpse the infinite. In the end, suffering is not simply something to be endured or avoided. It is a powerful force for transformation, one that has the potential to lead individuals into the depths of their spiritual journey. Whether through the teachings of religious texts or the personal experience of mystical insight, suffering serves as a sacred path to greater understanding, compassion, and union with the divine. It is, in many ways, the soul's most profound teacher, offering lessons that cannot be learned in any other way. Through suffering, we are not only refined but awakened to the deeper truths of our existence and our place in the universe. Chapter 5. Navigating Suffering with Spiritual Practices. "The wound is where the light enters you," wrote Rumi, capturing the paradox of suffering, that within our deepest pain lies the potential for profound spiritual awakening. Yet, as we face life's inevitable hardships, it is often difficult to recognize this potential. When we are engulfed by grief, loss, or personal failure, suffering can feel suffocating, as if there is no escape. But what if, rather than trying to avoid or eliminate suffering, we learned how to sit with it, to listen to its lessons? This is where spiritual practices come into play, offering us a path to navigate suffering, not as an enemy to be fought, but as a teacher to be understood. Through practices like meditation, prayer, and acts of service, we can learn to transform suffering into an opportunity for spiritual growth and connection. Meditation and mindfulness. One of the most powerful tools for navigating suffering is mindfulness, the practice of being fully present with our experience, whatever it may be. In times of suffering, the mind tends to wander into the past, replaying painful memories, or into the future, anxiously imagining worst-case scenarios. This mental agitation often amplifies the emotional and physical pain we are experiencing, making the suffering feel even more unbearable. Meditation and mindfulness help to break this cycle by bringing us back to the present moment, where we can meet our suffering with awareness and acceptance. When we practice mindfulness in the midst of suffering, we learn to observe our pain without judgment or resistance. Rather than trying to push the discomfort away or numb it with distractions, mindfulness invites us to sit with it, to investigate its texture, its emotional weight, and its impact on our body and mind. This practice can be transformative because it shifts our relationship with suffering. Instead of viewing it as something that must be eliminated at all costs, we begin to see it as part of the human experience, something that, while painful, can also offer valuable insights. Concentrating on the breath is a useful method to start applying mindfulness to deal with distress. Paying attention to the basic act of breathing might be beneficial during periods of severe pain or distress. Feel the breath filling your lungs with each inhalation and the release when you exhale. This easy exercise opens up space around your suffering and helps you stay rooted in the here and now. With time, you might have a less overwhelming sense of anguish, even though it is still there. While we may not always control the situations that cause us grief, mindfulness teaches us that we do have power over how we react to them. The importance of presence cannot be overstated when navigating hardship. Suffering often feels unbearable because we resist it, pushing it away with thoughts of, "This shouldn't be happening," or "I can't handle this." Mindfulness encourages us to stay present with what is, to soften our resistance and open ourselves to the full range of human experience, both joyful and painful. In doing so, we find that suffering, while difficult, is not insurmountable. It becomes something we can work with, learn from, and ultimately transcend. Prayer and contemplation. For many, prayer offers a lifeline during times of suffering, a way to connect with the divine, seek solace, and find meaning in the midst of pain. In moments of deep hardship, when it feels like the ground has been pulled out from under us, prayer can serve as an anchor, a reminder that we are not alone in our suffering. Across religious traditions, prayer is seen not only as a means of communication with a higher power, but also as a way of transforming suffering into spiritual growth. In Christianity, prayer during suffering is often framed as an act of surrender, where individuals turn to God for strength and comfort. In the face of illness, grief, or personal crisis, many Christians find solace in prayers like the Lord's Prayer or the Psalms, which offer words of comfort and reminders of God's presence. One particularly powerful example is the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, "Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith." This prayer transforms suffering into an opportunity to bring love and healing to the world, even in the midst of personal pain. In Buddhism, developing compassion and knowledge is a common goal of prayer. Metta, also known as loving-kindness meditation, is a type of prayer in which practitioners send blessings to themselves, other people, and even the suffering. By encouraging people to see beyond their own suffering and acknowledge that of others, this practice helps people develop a sense of oneness. Through prayer, suffering ceases to be a lonely experience, and instead becomes a universal human condition that can motivate deeds of compassion and goodwill. The ability of prayer to strengthen one's relationship with God and to reinterpret hardship as a tool for spiritual development is what makes it so effective in the midst of suffering. By praying, we give ourselves the chance to consider the possibility that there is meaning to our suffering and that it will help us understand ourselves and the world more fully. Prayer serves as a reminder that our suffering does not define us, and that even in the middle of it we are capable of finding joy, strength, and purpose. Acts of service and community. Performing acts of service is one of the most transforming approaches to deal with sorrow. When we are in pain, it is simple to lose ourselves in our own misery and to feel cut off from the outside world. However, when we focus on helping others and use our own grief as a trigger, we can experience some of the most profound healing. Serving others not only helps us turn our attention from our own suffering, but also gives it meaning and purpose. Think about Mother Teresa, who devoted her life to helping the most impoverished people. She turned her anguish into a mission of love and compassion while having to face her own personal challenges and doubts. Despite great personal and societal suffering, Mother Teresa discovered a stronger bond with the divine and a clear sense of purpose via her acts of service. Her example shows how serving others can turn adversity into spiritual development. Serving others fosters a sense of community and serves as a reminder that we are not alone in our suffering. As we assist others, we come to understand that suffering is a common experience that binds us to the larger human family. Acts of service, such as helping at a shelter, lending a sympathetic ear to a friend in need, or just being nice to strangers, serve as a reminder that even in the midst of our own pain, we have the ability to change the world for the better. Serving others often turns one's own suffering into a group's healing. By connecting with others, we spread empathy and a sense of connectedness that transforms our pain into a source of hope and light. One of the most potent ways that pain can promote spiritual development is by bringing us closer to the divine and other people rather than isolating us. Navigating suffering through spiritual practices like meditation, prayer, and acts of service allows us to transform pain into an opportunity for growth. Rather than resisting or fleeing from suffering, these practices teach us to embrace it as a part of the human experience and a path to deeper understanding and connection. Through presence, prayer, and service, we learn that suffering is not the end, but the beginning of a profound spiritual journey. It is through suffering that we are broken open, allowing the light of wisdom, compassion, and love to enter our lives. Chapter 6. Real-life examples of spiritual growth through suffering. In the midst of winter, I found there was, within me, an invincible summer. Albert Camus. It is often said that the most profound lessons in life are not learned in moments of comfort, but in times of great difficulty. While suffering is universally painful, its transformative power is undeniable. Across history, from famous leaders to everyday individuals, there are countless stories of people who have emerged from suffering not as victims, but as individuals strengthened, deepened, and profoundly changed by their experiences. These stories of spiritual growth serve as a mirror to our own lives, reflecting back the truth that within the darkness of suffering, there is the possibility of light, wisdom, and an unshakable inner strength. Take, for example, the remarkable story of Nelson Mandela. Imprisoned for 27 years under the oppressive apartheid regime in South Africa, Mandela's suffering was not only physical, but deeply emotional. Cut off from his family, enduring harsh conditions, and facing what seemed like an endless period of captivity, he could have easily succumbed to despair. Yet, Mandela's imprisonment became a crucible for spiritual transformation. Instead of being consumed by anger or bitterness, he used his suffering to cultivate patience, resilience, and compassion. He emerged from prison not as a broken man, but as a leader with a deep moral clarity and an unshakable commitment to reconciliation. Mandela's suffering taught him the power of forgiveness, a lesson he would later use to unite a deeply divided nation. He once said, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." His suffering was not in vain. It deepened his spiritual path, showing him that true liberation comes not from external freedom, but from the inner freedom of letting go of hatred. In this way, Mandela's personal suffering became a vehicle for not only his spiritual growth, but also the spiritual healing of an entire country. Similarly, Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and the author of Man's Search for Meaning, found profound spiritual growth through unimaginable suffering. Imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps, Frankl lost his family, his freedom, and very nearly his life. But rather than being broken by his suffering, he found a way to transcend it. In the midst of this suffering, Frankl realized that while the Nazis could take away his physical freedom, they could never take away his ability to choose how to respond to his circumstances. This realization, that there is meaning in suffering if we choose to find it, became the foundation of his life's work. Frankl's anguish inspired him to create his logotherapy theory, which holds that the fundamental purpose of existence is the pursuit of meaning. He noticed that people who were able to find purpose in their suffering had a higher chance of surviving the atrocities of the concentration camps than others who were hopeless. Frankl's personal experience with suffering led him to the deep spiritual realization that we all possess the capacity to find inner strength, meaning, and purpose, even in the most difficult situations. His narrative serves as a reminder that, despite its extreme pain, suffering may serve as a gateway to finding our inner strength and the purpose that keeps us going through life's obstacles. Mandela and Viktor Frankl are not exceptions. They are well-known people. The universal truth that pain can be transformed is brought to light by their stories if it is faced with bravery and an open heart. However, not just the renowned or exceptional can experience spiritual growth via hardship. Through their own struggles, regular individuals also undergo deep spiritual transformations. The youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, Malala Yousafzai, is another influential person whose life demonstrates the transformational power of suffering. When Malala became a teenager, the Taliban shot her in the head for supporting girls' education in Pakistan. She was thrown into an unfathomably painful and suffering world by the bullet, which did more than just puncture her skull. Faced with death and tragedy at such a young age, she was forced to flee her home country and receive intensive medical treatment. Malala, however, did not allow her pain to define her as a victim, just like Keller and Gandhi did. Rather than giving up, she fueled her cause with her suffering. Malala's refusal to seek retribution or harbor anger in response to her attackers demonstrated her spiritual development. She has talked about how her pain made her more committed to her cause of promoting girls' education, and how she saw her survival as a message from God that she was supposed to carry on with her work. Malala's suffering brought her not only recognition on a global scale, but also a stronger sense of purpose and a bond with the principles of justice, peace, and forgiveness. Her narrative demonstrates how a person's personal pain can inspire and transform them as well as the rest of the world. Take the case of famous American author, lecturer, and political activist Helen Keller, who lost her hearing and sight at the age of 19 months. Because of her limitations, Helen was cut off from the outside world for a long time, and for that reason, her world was silent and dark. She was emotionally alienated, irate, and frustrated. She frequently felt imprisoned by her incapacity to speak. However, under the devoted tutelage of her teacher, Anne Sullivan, Helen finally developed a profoundly intellectual and spiritual life and discovered how to communicate with the outside world using sign language. Helen's suffering did not diminish. Her physical limitations remained throughout her life. However, through her struggles, she discovered a profound inner strength and purpose. Her journey into language and communication opened up a new world for her, not just intellectually but spiritually. Keller later wrote about how her experiences with blindness and deafness gave her a unique understanding of human suffering and a deeper connection to what she called the unseen realities. Through her personal hardships, Helen Keller found the strength to advocate for the rights of others with disabilities, becoming a global symbol of resilience and spiritual growth. Her story reminds us that, even in the face of overwhelming challenges, we can find meaning, connection, and purpose. Spiritual growth through suffering is not about finding quick answers or instant relief. It is about embracing the process of transformation, allowing suffering to break open the heart, and making space for new understandings and connections to emerge. For some, this growth happens through meditation and prayer, as they seek solace in spiritual practices that help them navigate their pain. For others, it happens through service as they turn their personal suffering into a source of healing for others. Ultimately, the stories of spiritual growth through suffering, whether from famous figures or everyday people, reveal the universal truth that suffering, while deeply painful, holds within it the seeds of transformation. When we are willing to face our suffering, rather than run from it, we open ourselves to the possibility of profound spiritual growth. We discover that within the darkness of suffering, there is a light that leads us to deeper wisdom, compassion, and connection with ourselves, others, and the divine. Suffering may be inevitable, but it is also a sacred opportunity to grow, to learn, and to find meaning in the most difficult moments of life. In conclusion, the role of suffering in spiritual growth is undeniable. Through the stories of people like Nelson Mandela, Viktor Frankl, Helen Keller, Malala Yousafzai, and countless others, we see that suffering can break us open in ways that allow for deep transformation. Whether through famous historical figures or the personal anecdotes of everyday individuals, these examples teach us that suffering, though difficult, is one of life's greatest teachers. It strips away illusions, deepens our connection to the divine, and reminds us that even in the darkest of times, we have the capacity for resilience, compassion, and spiritual awakening. Conclusion. Suffering is one of life's greatest teachers. The challenge lies not in avoiding it, but in learning how to welcome it as part of the journey to spiritual awakening. Life is frequently likened to a journey, and just like any trip, it has its share of happy, triumphant, loving, and connecting moments. However, it is also unavoidably characterized by times of suffering, adversity, and loss. Even while it seems sense to look for solace and protection, suffering is an inevitable aspect of being human. The profound learning that suffering brings when we are willing to face it head-on is less evident, though. A strong spiritual growth catalyst, suffering can help us become more self-aware and connect with the fundamental truths of our existence. One thing has emerged as being quite evident from this examination of the role that suffering plays in spiritual development. Our spiritual path is determined by our response to suffering, not by the suffering itself. Our sense of control is destroyed by suffering, which forces us to face life's uncertainties and transience. By doing thus, it offers us a chance, a portal to personal growth and awakening. People like Viktor Frankl, Malala Yousafzai, and Nelson Mandela provide us examples of how facing personal hardship with courage and transparency can result in a deeper sense of purpose and spiritual insight. Rather than being something to be feared, suffering can act as a mirror reflecting not only our resilience and growth potential, but also our innermost anxieties and vulnerabilities. It compels us to enter the deeper currents of life, where true self-awareness lies, and leave the shallow waters of comfort. When faced with hardship, we have two options. Either we choose to ignore the suffering in an attempt to become numb or escape it, or we choose to embrace it and allow it to lead us to a deeper level of comprehension and compassion. Think about how suffering undermines the ego by removing the layers of identity we cling to, such as our connections, status, and belongings, and leaving us with the essential nature of who we really are. The deeper realities of our spiritual path are frequently most accessible to us during these vulnerable times when we feel most lost and damaged. A more genuine connection to the divine, the universe, or oneself arises as the ego, which feeds on control and attachment, starts to crumble under the weight of sorrow. In this way, suffering is a traveling partner on the spiritual path rather than an enemy. It instills humility in us by serving as a constant reminder of our common humanity and the certainty of suffering. We learn compassion through suffering, not just for ourselves but also for others who are going through difficult times. We start to realize that suffering is a common experience shared by all people, and that our capacity to persevere through it and rise above it is evidence of the resilience of the human spirit. Suffering leads to spiritual growth, but this process is not simple or quick. It takes bravery, perseverance, and the ability to tolerate discomfort while sitting. However, as exemplified by numerous globally renowned spiritual luminaries, the outcomes of this endeavor are priceless. A stronger feeling of purpose, a better connection to life's spiritual aspects, and a profound inner calm can all result from suffering. It serves as a reminder that we are stronger than our circumstances, and that everyone has the ability to overcome hardship and find purpose in life, even in the most difficult situations. In the end, to view suffering as something to be avoided is to miss out on one of life's most powerful teachers. Rather than running from it, we can choose to embrace suffering as part of our spiritual journey, a necessary step toward awakening to our true nature. By facing suffering with an open heart, we allow it to transform us, guiding us toward greater wisdom, compassion, and self-awareness. Suffering, while painful, is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a deeper journey into the heart of what it means to be human, to love, to lose, and ultimately, to transcend. The spiritual path is not one of avoidance or escape, but of courageously embracing all that life has to offer, the joy and the sorrow, the light and the darkness. In doing so, we discover that suffering is not a barrier to our spiritual growth, but the very ground upon which it stands.